think it's terrific, and I commend CEDA on the report that you've put out. Having the report that provides the economic analysis, the policy context, and puts out the recommendations about what we need to be thinking about stimulates debate, and we need to have that sort of open debate. What I do wonder, though, is in terms of getting community support, what more do we need to do to actually get community support? I do worry that in some ways good economics and good policy arguments may not be enough. It's almost as if when we look at Brexit, when we look at Hanson, when we look at, goodness me, what could happen this weekend in the US, and the way that people are responding, what more do we need to do to say that we've got a sound anchor point with those solid arguments, but how do we engage the community? So one of the things that I've looked at, and particularly given that I sit on the Ministerial Advisory Council for Skilled Migration, I'll call it MAXIM because I'll refer to it as we go through, is what can we do as a council to be able to help with that engagement with the community, because it is what's missing. It should be the role of government. Sometimes, you could almost say, has the role of government become a bit confused? But it's something that we can take on. So what I'm going to do is actually look at some of the recommendations that are in the report, and I'll particularly focus on the recommendations around MAXIM, some of the recommendations around the temporary migration and the regional aspect as well, drawing further on what Tim talked about. So the recommendations around MAXIM was really to reconstitute the membership and the accountability, so it provides objective and evidence-based independent advice. And one of the recommendations, the first recommendation, was really to have equal membership from both industry and the unions. There is only one union member on the council at the moment, and that's Jed Carney from the ACTU. But one thing I should note is that for those of us that sit on there, we don't necessarily represent our organisations, and we shouldn't. We bring with it the skills and expertise that we have from that sort of experience, but we shouldn't be there representing a membership. And I'm probably the other independent member of that council now, given that I haven't been part of an organisation for almost 18 months now. One of the things I think we need to do, though, is actually say, what are the outcomes we're seeking to achieve by having independent advice provided to the minister? It is ultimately up to the minister to act. And I'm not sure that changing the constitution of the membership may quite be the way that you would get that outcome. But what I have taken on board is the transparency. So if we look at ensuring that the processes, deliberations, finding and recommendations of the council are accessible to the public, I think that's very important. Because what came through in reading the report, particularly the chapter that talked about the recommendations on MAXIM, was a lot of people don't know what we do. A lot of people don't know that we have actually been undertaking a very comprehensive review of the consolidated skills occupation list. There have been a couple of people who have approached us when it has come to their attention. I know that, I met with one particular organisation, and I actually said to them, write to us. We've got a meeting in a month. Make sure you get a letter through to the Secretariat before that meeting, and we will discuss it. There are another two organisations I spoke to and told them to do that. It did mean it got on the agenda for discussion. We've got to find a better way of being able to engage with the community and engage with groups so that they know they can participate in consultation. And we've got to find that balance because, for a lot of organisations, they can suffer consultation fatigue. You don't necessarily know where to go looking. In fact, the current consultation around the skilled occupation list, the CSOL, does sit on a website. It doesn't sit on the website of Immigration and Border Protection. It actually sits on the website of, and I'll just get it for you, it sits on the employment website. So for people who are looking for this sort of input, they've got to know where to go. What we do, though, when we sit on that Ministerial Advisory Council is we do have quite a robust discussion. We don't just take one view. We do look at what are the opportunities to be able to provide a list that assists with providing the gaps. One of the biggest challenges we're looking at the moment is how do you actually identify the occupations that need to be on that list that are going to be the skills we need for the future? How do you identify them now? And that comes to some of these challenges around temporary migration. Temporary migration is currently uncapped. If you were to cap it, do you then put another constraint that means it's not as flexible? So one of the things we're grappling with is how do you actually build flexibility that allows you to respond not just to adding occupations to that list, but removing them. So a classic example is what's happened in the mining sector and the FIFO workforce. And that's not just in mining, but also in agriculture as well. You've got a FIFO workforce there. With the mining boom going off, how do we respond to be able to take certain jobs off that list? But by the same token, what's emerging areas? And some of the emerging areas that I know I'm involved with are the areas of aged care and disability care. Now, I sit on the board of Australian Unity. We know there is going to be a huge gap in being able to fill a whole range of jobs in the aged care sector, in the disability sector. How will we find them? How do we actually identify that? And when we looked at the broader context, I think one of the things we do need to do is not just focus on whether this is a policy for domestic Australian workers or whether this is a policy for overseas workers. What are these skills we need for the future? And how do we actually come up with a mix that allows us to meet that? And how do we make sure it's flexible? Another challenge that we're grappling with is that the lists tend to refer to the ANSCO list, which gets updated once every 15 years, and it's backwards looking. So once again, the challenge is, how can you anticipate what you need in the future, and how do you ensure that you can actually meet that need? So those are the sort of things we're looking at now. I think that one of the things we're going to be able to do, and one of the things, Stephen, I think that CEDA will be able to do for us is write to us. Send us a copy of the report. I'll certainly be taking it the next meeting is on the 2nd of December. We can then put it on the agenda because I can then be pushing the fact that we need to be a lot more transparent. If no one knows about us, how can they engage with us? If we're not actually providing that messaging, how do we actually bridge that gap between the good economic policy arguments and the community noise that just is getting a huge pace that means that we're starting to ignore those sound policy arguments? So I think on those particular recommendations, I certainly don't necessarily disagree that having an independent commission may be, is something that is not a good thing. I'm saying we've got Maxim at the moment. How do we use Maxim? Push us so that we're doing what you want us to do, and if we're not, look at what the alternative should be. Another issue I want to look at, and that is in relation to regional. And I think, given the background I've had in regional economic development, one of the things I would say is we need to be careful about centralising policy in this area. You quite often need place-based solutions. And what works in one region might not work in another. The need in one region may be quite different from another. And at the federal or Commonwealth level, how do they know what a particular local need is? So I think it is important that we do engage and we involve the states, but we also involve local government to be able to identify where some of those needs can be. And that's why I do still continue to see a role for temporary migration, because you do have ebbs and flows. And this also takes us to the area of backpackers and agriculture, because they're seasonal workers. But there's some really interesting initiatives you can put in place around that. For example, in the fishing sector, they've actually identified that they had a real need for certain equipment drivers in South Australia. In engaging with the grain sector, they worked out that they had the same need for the same skills, but at different times of the year. So instead of just relying on backpackers, they've actually now been able to put in place a skilling program that will actually provide work for people moving to that particular region for most of the year. So it's really starting to say, what are the skills we need and how can we best utilise them, and not just look at it just on an industry basis, but what are the skills we have there as well. I think one of the things that we also probably just need to be very much aware of is, and we hear a lot about it, and it was interesting in the report when it looked at youth unemployment, having done a lot of work in some of the regions, and you've got a number of regions, in fact Queensland has got some of the highest youth unemployment in regional areas in the country, and you know, it's up north of the Sunshine Coast around Hervey Bay. When we look at what do we do to attract people to regional areas, we've got to think about what are the sort of skills programs that we can actually attract people from, people who live here as well as those that come from overseas. The other thing, and this will be the final thing I'll say on attracting people to regional areas, and that is, we hear a lot about infrastructure. And when people talk about infrastructure, they talk about hard infrastructure. Roads, rail, ports, soft infrastructure. For a lot of the work I did when I was at the Regional Australia Institute, that was what made the difference. Your access to services, health and education. If you don't have those, you won't attract people. It doesn't matter if you have the best roads that exist. If you haven't got the access to health, to schools, to the capacity to be able to provide a life, not just for the worker but for their families, then you will not actually get people to move to that region and stay in that region. The Pilbara was a really good example of this. You had a huge number of fly in, fly out workers until they started to have, and it came from their royalties for the regions, they started to invest in the sort of infrastructure, both hard and soft, that you needed. So they didn't just have the workers there, they moved the families there, and the families wanted to stay. And if you can do that, you will actually get a better capacity to have people that will not only, you'll attract them to regional areas, but you'll get them to stay there. And they'll be like me. Stephen didn't stay in a regional area. I'm staying in a regional area. I've been there for 25 years and I'm not moving. Thank you.